So the iPhone 14 Pro has a new 48 megapixel camera, but megapixels are never the whole story for any camera. So I thought it'd be fun to compare it to this high-end professional camera, the Canon R5, because this has a similar 45 megapixel sensor. Now other people have done similar tests where they went out and about and took some general regular photos that you might expect, but I thought it would be more interesting to do a extreme low light test that was a bit more technical. You might think, well, obviously the big camera is going to win because it has a way bigger sensor, therefore it can capture more light and just look better. But also consider that the iPhone has a bunch of computational techniques it can use, such as combining a bunch of photos into one as you press the shutter, which the Canon can't do. And also the iPhone does have night mode, which the Canon doesn't. So I did a bunch of comparisons, and while some results were expected, there were some pretty surprising ones too. So first what I'll do is explain some things like the actual tests I did, and then we can later go and look at the computer and look at the results. I did 3 different tests, each comparing different conditions and photo modes. All of them involved pointing the cameras at a few calibration charts to make it easier to tell any difference in details, and for every set of tests, I repeated each one using different lighting conditions and brightness conditions. To do that, I went into a room that was blocked off from light except for a bunch of Philips Hue bulbs where I can control the brightness of each one, so I just set them to different levels. So for each set of the 3 tests, I used 5 different brightness levels: 100%, 50%, 25%, 10%, and 1%. Now, before explaining the 3 tests, I need to give you a very quick crash course on the so-called exposure triangle of photography, so you know what the heck I'm talking about. So bear with me, but if you already know about this, you can just skip ahead. So basically, when you go to take a picture, there's going to be 3 different factors that will affect how bright or dark the final image will be. One is the shutter speed. That's just how long the camera collects light for, and the longer the shutter speed, the brighter the image, but you risk introducing motion blur from moving the camera. Then there's the ISO, which you can basically think of like the sensitivity setting. And a higher ISO will mean a brighter image, but a higher ISO also degrades the picture quality with more noise. Third is the aperture, which is how wide you open the lens to let light through. A bigger hole will let in more light, but every lens is going to have a maximum aperture size they can open to. And this is measured in f-stops, but don't worry about that. And basically, getting a properly exposed image is like a balancing act between these 3 factors. If you increase or decrease one factor and you want to keep the brightness of the image the same, then you're going to have to increase or decrease one of the other factors to compensate. Now, in our case, the iPhone's aperture is fixed, which means it's not going to change. So just to keep things simple, I'm also going to keep the aperture size of the Canon camera the same between tests too. Therefore, really the only things you're going to hear me mention are the shutter speed and the ISO. So again, just remember a higher ISO equals a brighter image, but noisier, and a slower shutter speed means more light, but potentially more motion blur if you aren't using a tripod or don't have a steady hand. Alright, so now I can explain the 3 tests I did. The first was the main one that I was curious about when I first heard about the new iPhone's camera. For each brightness level in the room that I set, I took 2 photos. One with the iPhone in 48 megapixel Pro RAW mode, and I just let it do auto exposure, but I did not use night mode for this one. Then I looked at what settings the iPhone had automatically used for that shot and set the Canon camera to exactly match those settings. I used the same shutter speed, ISO, and I even used a 50mm lens that was capable of shooting f1.8, which is basically the same aperture size as the iPhone, so it all is the same. So the point of this test is really to do an apples to apples comparison of how the iPhone with its computational photography and a tiny little sensor can stack up against a professional size camera with a big sensor. For the next test, I took 3 photos for each brightness level. First was with the iPhone in 48 megapixel RAW mode like before, then one with night mode in RAW, but there is a 12 megapixel limit to night mode in the camera, so I couldn't do 48 with that one. And finally, one with the Canon R5, and I just kept the aperture at an arbitrary f5.6 for these. Also for these tests, I just let the iPhone use auto exposure, so I wasn't controlling the shutter speed or ISO, and also with the Canon R5, I had the ISO set to 400 that I just kept the same, and just let it choose the shutter speed, which got kind of long, and then when it started to get really dark in the room, I also tested that using some higher ISOs, but you'll see what I mean. For the final tests, I directly compared the iPhone's 48 megapixel and 12 megapixel modes, both in Pro RAW. And this test was because I wanted to dispel a very common myth that a lower megapixel count means better low light performance. Even Apple in their presentation talked about how they kept it so the camera by default combines each pixel into 4, so it only outputs 12 megapixel images unless you enable ProRAW, which outputs huge files. There's no option to use JPEG 48 megapixel, for example. The idea being that even though it's a lower resolution, each pixel is actually going to be using 4 pixels worth of light, which means it'll have more light, less noise, and look better. That's the idea. Except in reality, having more megapixels more than makes up for the difference in noise you get from having smaller pixels, which I'll show you. Now, one caveat, using lower megapixels will allow you to use slower shutter speeds because motion blur will not be as obvious in a lower megapixel count, just because there's less detail. But that will only really matter in low light. And it's not like you're getting more detail because of the bigger pixels, it's only because you're using a longer shutter speed. So anyway, enough talk. Now that you know what I did, let's go to the computer and look at the results. All right, now these tests I think are more interesting. This is where the R5 was set to the same exact exposure settings for each shot of the iPhone. So the R5 did not have all the time in the world to record. It used the exact same settings that the iPhone was able to, so we can really compare the performance of the sensor apple to apples. So this is at 100% light level, and you can see, relatively close. Actually, I would say that the iPhone image looks a little better. Now, part of that could be it's a slightly higher resolution sensor, but I think this at least shows with the same exact exposure levels with adequate light, the iPhone really holds up against a professional level mirrorless camera. However, that'll probably start to break down when we get to less light. So this is with the lights at 50%. And if we zoom in, it actually also looks pretty darn good, almost comparable. I, in fact, think that there's probably less color noise in the iPhone image. Now, at 25%, this is where things definitely start to become more noticeable. Now, again, remember, we're zooming in 200%. This is more than the native resolution, so it's probably not going to look as good as it should anyway. However, you can still see that the iPhone numbers on here are getting blotchier, whereas on the Canon, you can still easily tell what these numbers are supposed to be. On the iPhone, you can tell for most of them, but some of them are getting blotchier. But there are still some points where I think the iPhone actually still holds up maybe even better. Like down here, you can maybe even see a little bit more contrast in these fine lines than you can with the Canon. Now, you can obviously tell what's going on with Canon, but maybe it just holds up a little better contrast with the iPhone. I don't know. Overall, though, the Canon definitely is outperforming here. Now, when we get down to 10% light, this is where things get really obvious. So again, the numbers are extremely blotchy. You can't even tell what these numbers are supposed to be, I don't think. Whereas on the Canon, yeah, there's a ton of color noise here, but you could tell what this is supposed to say. Now, actually, for these concentric circles, I think the iPhone holds up better than it does with the text over there. That might just be how the algorithm is able to handle lines and stuff better than text. I don't know. And actually, you can sort of say the same about these middle lines here. It still looks relatively sharp for how bad the numbers are looking. Now, if we zoom out, you can also tell that in less detailed areas like the wood on the floor, the iPhone is way blotchier. You can not really tell what's going on. With the Canon, you still can to some degree if you zoom out enough. And also the handle on this dresser, it looks like a blotchy mess, whereas on the Canon, you can actually tell that's a little handle there. Also, the darker parts of the iPhone image are just kind of melding into black, whereas on the right, you can sort of distinguish them still. Now, for 1% brightness level, it's not even a contest. And you might think, oh, well, why not brighten the iPhone image? Well, I basically got them to the same level of brightness for this white part. And it's just that the Canon was able to hold on way more detail in the shadows, whereas it's pretty much all gone on the iPhone. So it really is similar brightness level. It's just the dark parts are gone here. And if we zoom in, you can clearly still see there's lines here, whereas on the iPhone, it's all just a blotchy mess. I mean, you can still tell there's lines, but you can't tell that there's a circle in there, I don't think at all. And again, you can sort of see the circles here are kind of half gone, whereas you can still see them pretty easily on the Canon. So for me, the takeaway for this test is the iPhone holds up really well compared to a dedicated, very large sensor camera up until about 25% in this test, which is kind of the point where you'd start to want to use night mode anyway. So I am really impressed with how this 48 megapixel mode is working. Yeah, the Canon was always going to be better, but the iPhone is working better than what I expected. Okay, so here we have the brightness level of the lights in the room at 100%. On the left, we have the iPhone not doing night mode. It's just automatic exposure shot. And on the right, we have the R5 doing the same thing, although I did fix the aperture size at f5.6 and the ISO at 400. So the only thing that's going to be changing between the shots for the R5 for every brightness level is the exposure time. Whereas with the iPhone, it's going to be adjusting the ISO and the shutter speed. So at adequate light levels, if we zoom into both, we can actually see that they're actually a little bit comparable. Obviously, the R5 is sharper if you zoom in, and keep in mind this is at 200%. So this is already bigger than the native image. If we look at 100% zoom for both of them, it's even closer. It's even harder to tell. Yeah, if you look really closely at some of these lines at the bottom, you can tell that the R5 is sharper. But overall, if you're just taking an everyday shot, not of a calibration chart, it probably would be very hard to tell the difference between the two, especially if you didn't have them side by side. So very impressive image quality from the iPhone in general. And it would probably be even better if it was outside with way more light. This is even at 100% lights, not exactly the brightest room. Now for each level, I also took a night mode shot, though with the way the iPhone works, it only takes the night mode shot in 12 megapixels, so you can't take it in 48 megapixels. So it's not going to be really useful to compare the night mode shot until we get to way lower brightness levels. We'll get to that in a bit. All right, so this is with the lights at 50%. And what you're going to notice is because the R5 will just do slower and slower shutter speed every time, no matter the brightness, it's going to basically look the same. So it probably makes more sense to start comparing the different brightness levels just compared to the iPhone. So obviously with half the amount of light, the numbers start to look a little bit blotchier, but overall it's not a massive difference. The phone still does reasonably well. So let's go down to 25%. This is where things start to get a little bit more interesting. So on the left is the iPhone normal exposure type and 25% brightness. And this is where things start to get kind of messy. You can see there's a lot more noise in the color, and the lines starting to look a lot smudgier. And if we compare that to 100% light, you can definitely tell that on the right, it's a lot sharper. However, this is where we should probably start taking into account the night mode possibility. But even still, if we zoom into just the regular exposure and compare it to night mode, we can still see there is definitely more detail in the non-night mode exposure. So it's still worth it, even at a pretty low light level, 25% is very dark, still worth it to keep using the 48 megapixel and not even necessarily do night mode. Of course, this is with a completely still tripod, but still. Now, the next one though, 10%, is where things start to shift. So on the left, we have 10% light level, normal exposure. On the right, it's the same except we use night mode. And I don't know if it'll show up even on the video too well, but on the left, the wood on the floor looks way smudgier, whereas on the right, way more detail. And so this is where it starts to kind of shift in the night mode's favor. So if we zoom in, on the surface, you might think that the normal exposure looks sharper. There's definitely more grain, whereas on the right, there's not so much grain. It looks a little bit more out of focus, whereas the left one, it kind of looks more in focus, just less detailed. But if we start to look, for example, down here at this circle, you can't see the concentric rings around the middle, whereas on this one, the night mode, you can. And at the top left, we can see the same. You can see the circles here, whereas you can't see them here, even though this is a quarter of the resolution. This is only 12 megapixels, this is 48. It's also apparent in the numbers. I don't know about you, but I can not even read what these numbers are necessarily, whereas on the right, yeah, they're a little bit blurry, but you can definitely tell what these numbers are supposed to be. And just for further demonstration, on the night mode, you can maybe even read what these letters are. You can obviously tell this is text, whereas on the left, it's just like a smudge. I don't even know what these would possibly say. So it seems like at a certain point, you'll definitely get a better benefit from the night mode, even at lower resolution, than you would at 40 megapixels. However, it has to be really dark for that to happen, which would probably be nighttime. Makes sense. So in a dark room, a dim interior at night, I would probably say probably still worth it to take 48 megapixel. But if you're outside actually at night, I do think night mode is the winner. And finally, at an extreme level, this is with the lights at 1%, very, very dark in the room, practically no light at all. And we can see, I mean, there is no detail in the floor here in the normal exposure. In the night mode, floor looks totally fine. I mean, yeah, if you zoomed in, actually, it's still pretty sharp, especially for a 12 megapixel camera, looks fine. And if we zoom in further, you know, there's actually a surprising amount of detail in the 48 megapixel shot at this brightness level. I assume it has to do with some kind of method for how the compression is decided for where to put the data, the iPhone does, but still undoubtedly the 12 megapixel night mode has more information. Again, with these rings at the top, it almost looks like part of the circle is missing, whereas here you can tell it's all there. Again, with the numbers, you can kind of tell what these numbers are. With on the left, they just look like smudges. So at a dark light level, night mode undoubtedly wins, whereas at even adequate light levels, if it's not dark in the room, if you wouldn't consider it dark, I would still probably stick to the 48 megapixel mode. Now, finally, if you want to see how the R5 compares at this very extreme scenario, I did take it with a couple ISO sensitivities so we can compare. So again, we have on the left the iPhone normal mode, and on the right, the R5. Obviously, the R5 is sharper, but keep in mind, the iPhone took this image at 1/30th of a second, and ISO 25,000, whereas the R5 had the advantage here of being able to sit for 25 seconds to take this image. So obviously that's not really a realistic scenario. So let's compare it to 6400 ISO. Starting to get a lot more noise here, and we can go to 12,800. So this is 1 second exposure with the R5, and obviously still not really a comparison with 1/30th of a second. So let's use the night mode to compare. So if we compare, on the left is iPhone night mode with the 3-second nighttime exposure, and on the right we have the R5 at 1 second, ISO 12,800. Still, the R5 wins. I don't think that should be a surprise. However, it's a lot closer than before. I mean, you can still read what these numbers are supposed to be, and you can still distinguish these lines, and we can actually switch it to maybe 5 seconds. It looks about the same, night mode 5 seconds. But, I mean, the iPhone holds up for still being this dark at that small of a sensor. It's really not bad. So this just shows how good night mode is on the iPhone. It can almost compensate for having such a small sensor. And if it's just, you know, an average shot, this is more than adequate. All right, so this final test, I did 48 megapixel mode normal versus normal 12 megapixel mode. So no night mode. Also, I let it do auto exposure so it would be a little bit more realistic for what you're going to get. And that will definitely come into play for the extreme low light ones we'll see in a second. So first of all, if we zoom in on at 100% light level, obviously the 48 megapixel is more detailed at adequate light levels. I mean, there's no question about it. You can't read the numbers here at all. You can on this. We can just move on from this. This is not a surprise. At 50% light level, same story, not really interesting. The 48 megapixel, way better. Now we're down to 25%. You might think, all right, well, maybe this is where, with the extra light collecting ability of the 12 megapixel, it'll start to look better. But if we zoom in, nope, still way better with the 48 megapixel. You can see the lines way more clearly, still kind of blurry on the 12 megapixel. And also keep in mind, this is actually with the 12 megapixel mode having a bit of an advantage because it's at 3200 ISO. It's a lower ISO and also a longer shutter speed. That's why it was able to have the lower ISO. So this one actually has an advantage over this one, which is 5000 ISO, only a 30th of a second. Now at 10%, things start to get a little bit more interesting. So you can see on the left that the wood is getting blotchier again, like it did in the past. On the right, I would say that the wood is sharper. It's more coherent. You can still see the grain, whereas this one, it just looks kind of like a pixelated mess. However, if we do zoom in to the center, we're still seeing that there's considerably more sharpness in the 48 megapixel. So overall, in the details of the image, the 48 megapixel still performs really well, whereas maybe in the darker parts that aren't as detailed, you do get an advantage from having
the 1/15th of a second exposure time versus 1/30th. From my experience, it seems like with the 48 megapixel mode, the slowest shutter speed you're going to get is 1/30th of a second, whereas at 12 megapixel, it seems to be able to go down to 1/15th. And I believe that's because if you're at a higher megapixel, you're going to get way more noticeable movement or motion blur because there's more data. So I believe that's why even at a way lower light level, it chose to bump up the ISO instead of get a more light from the shutter speed. And if we go down to 1% light, it just becomes even more extreme. So on the left, same as before, we see the floor is just a blotchy mess, no detail in here whatsoever. It looks like the algorithm tried to do something with it, but it's nonsense. Now, if we zoom in, yeah, it still looks kind of crappy, but you still get some detail in some places. You can still tell there's lines here. On the right, it also looks pretty bad. Now, you could argue that the left image is better than the right one. If you're just looking at the brighter parts with high contrast, yeah, the 48 megapixel is going to do better. But I think overall, especially if there's a lot of dark parts in the image, then yeah, the slower shutter speed is just going to give it so much of a higher advantage. So when they're saying that when you bin down the pixels, you can collect 4 times more light, I think the only advantage that gives you is you can get slower shutter speeds. I don't know how accurate that would be if it allowed the 48 megapixel to go down to a slower shutter speed. I still think it would probably look better, but in auto mode, they chose to not have that. So in extremely dark situations, yeah, the 12 megapixel is going to look better. But in that case, you'd probably want to be using night mode, which would switch to 12 megapixel automatically. So it seems like, in my opinion, if you're going to be taking a ProRAW image, just keep it on 48 megapixels all the time. There's no reason to use 12 megapixels unless you want to save space, because if you get to the point where the 12 megapixel is going to have an advantage over the 48 megapixel, you're going to be using night mode anyway, and it'll switch to that automatically. So I don't think there's a reason to have it at 12 megapixel RAW based on what I'm seeing here.
All right, so I think the results pretty much speak for themselves, but I was definitely impressed with how well the iPhone's 48 megapixel camera with such a tiny sensor did stack up against a professional one with bigger sensor. Obviously, it's not as good in lower light situations as expected, but if it's dark enough, you can just use night mode, which works really well. Now, I don't think this means you should keep Pro RAW mode enabled all the time, but if you are taking a picture of something and you want more detail, then definitely enable the 48 megapixel RAW mode and use that. And if you need more light, then just use night mode. So let me know what you think of the results and maybe if you were surprised. If you enjoyed this video, I spent a lot of time on it, I'd appreciate a thumbs up, and also consider maybe checking out some of my more recent videos and consider subscribing. And if you do, also be sure to click the bell next to the subscribe button to enable notifications. These days you might not get videos recommended even if you do subscribe. If you want to keep watching, the next video I'd recommend is where I talked about 10 computer security myths that you should stop believing if you already do. So I'll put that link right there you can click on. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.